How are y'all? It's Daryl Black again, back with you. We're having some trouble with Facebook, so we're just going to record this and post it up in a little while. So unfortunately, we won't be able to have a conversation as we go along, and won't be able to take any questions right now. But as I was saying in the live feed before it shut down, this is probably going to be a 2 or maybe 3 part series on democratic religion and religious history in the United States from about the end of the American Revolution through the Civil War era. And we've talked about some of these aspects of American religion already, but it just seemed to me as we started talking more about it, the questions started coming from y'all, that it would be helpful to take a much broader view of American history and kind of think about some of the larger themes, some of the larger trajectories in American history to better understand the real specifics of what's going on in the African American church, what's going on in the Confederate churches during the wartime period. So to that end, I put together a talk today to focus on a couple of really important books that explore the ways that American religious history developed and the very uniqueness or the very unique nature of American history or American religious history in the post-revolutionary era. And the 2 books that I'm really drawing most heavily on are Nathan Hatch's The Democratization of American Christianity and Mark Noll's America's God. And Rob will be sharing the titles and the publisher's information on the post once this goes up. So you'll be able to get your hands on these books and read through them. I think that they're probably the 2 of the best works on American history, much less than American religious history, but just American history in general. So it's Mark Noll's America's God and Nathan Hatch's Democratization of American Christianity. And really what both of these authors and both of these historians look at are the developments in American theology and American church organization in the era after the American Revolution. Hatch was the one who was the author who coined the term democratic religion. It's an incredibly important book, a pivotal book that explains the ways that popular religion developed in the United States. And Hatch really takes his beginning point from a pretty, almost say an obvious, but by now it's kind of an obvious thing, but back in 1989, 1990, it wasn't perhaps is well known or well understood. But what he says is that the American Revolution is first the most important event in American history, and I think that's an accurate description, because if you look at the American Civil War, both Northerners and Southerners are claiming the heritage of the Revolution. They're claiming the true meaning of the Revolution. So even in the war that we focus on here at Seminary Ridge Museum, and where we focus most of our content programming on, that is a reaction, a response, a follow-up to what happened in the Revolution. And what Hatch argues is that in the Revolution, you don't just have a political shift and political change, which is incredibly important, but there's also an expanding circle of people who consider themselves capable of thinking for themselves about issues as varied as freedom, equality, about sovereignty, representation. It questions authority. It questions the assumed respect for authority that had dominated, or at least been a major theme in European and then European colonial history up to 1775. He argues that tradition, station, and education were eroded by the American Revolution, and that the common man or the everyday person could participate, or could at least make a claim to participation. Remember, we talked about this a little bit with the way that African American church members in Augusta, Georgia in the 1820s and the 1830s claimed their American heritage. They claimed to be Americans. They claimed a space, a place in America through the ways that they practiced their Baptist faith in Augusta, Georgia. So I think that Hatch really kind of opens this door in cultural and social history to understanding at the grassroots level, the import of the American Revolution. Others have followed up on this. T.H. Breen and others have really carried this theme forward more politically and more socially, but Hatch really kind of helps open that door in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Something that's absolutely central to this, and again, this is kind of one of those points that seems self-evident now, but the idea that disestablishment, the elimination of a formal state-supported church, changed the nature of America's religious practices. It opened up the field of religious organizations to a variety of denominations, a variety of sects, a variety of competing ideas and competing narratives, competing theological ideas. Hatch doesn't deal that much with the theological side of things. Noel follows that up in the early 2000s in the book. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But Hatch is really interested in the structures, in the social structures of the American church as it develops, and what is happening to Christianity as it's viewed through the lens of the American Revolution. It becomes a dominant theme. Becomes a dominant theme that runs through the 19th century. It changes slightly after the American Civil War, but still there's a this populist notion, the common sense theologies, the common sense approach to theology is still a dominant force in American culture today. Again, it's different. It's 200 some odd years past now, but these ideas that Hatch sketches out and that result from disestablishment at the end of the Revolution is a very important starting point because it opens the field. It opens the field to competing denominations and competing versions of how the church should function. This is not to say disestablishment is not to say that that people didn't think that religion was an important part of American national identity. Or a foundational block for creating American nation or national identity. In fact, it very much is, but it's not a top-down kind of relationship like you had seen in England, like you'd seen in Scotland, like you'd seen in Europe more broadly. So this is a very important starting point. And of course, you could imagine that people who had grown up in those traditions, grown up as Lutherans, who's grown up as members of the Church of England, Church of Scotland, Catholics, really kind of look askance at this. And this is an important observation to make, because some of our best insights into the ways that this religious world was built in the early 19th century is from the lens or from the perspective of those whose authority is being challenged and who do not look so positively on the changes that are taking place. This is a conversation. It's not one-sided. In fact, you could had you been standing here on the campus of the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the 1830s and the 1840s, you'd have seen this very conversation. This conversation about what direction, a confessional direction or an evangelical direction, should the church take. So right here on the campus, I'm sitting in Samuel Simon Schmucker's bedroom right now. And Schmucker himself was the leader of the evangelical faction of the Lutheran Church in the United States and in the mid 19th century. So you can see that very specifically here. This tension between the traditional old ways, the confessional religion of Lutheranism, and the evangelical popular conversion based. Every man his own theologian sort of approach that you see in revivalist impulses that you see in America more broadly. There are a couple of great quotes that Hatch pulls out that kind of illustrate the points in very broad ways, but from the perspective of people in the 19th century. The first comes from a theologian named Harrison Gray Otis. He wrote in 1836, and he's looking at the situation. He's looking at the religious landscape in the United States, and he writes, "All Christendom has been decomposed, broken in pieces, and resolved into new combinations and affinities. This is not the case in 1775. So between 1775, Otis is pointing out, in 1836, the entire ground of Christianity in the United States has changed. It's changed dramatically, and it's changed in ways that were unexpected. It's a very unique, and this is one of the things, we're the inheritors of that, of this tradition. This is the thing. Some of these things I want to talk about are quote unquote common sense to us. This is the experience that we've had as Americans. But this is not something that historians say, and contemporaries will make the same argument. This is something new under the sun. This is not something that was expected. These were developments that came wholly unexpected in the wake of the American Revolution. So this dynamism that you see in the first part of the 19th century is profoundly American, profoundly influential in American social life and American national identity. And through the middle 19th century and even beyond, the political life of the United States. So these are very, very important changes that are being made. This is a very different way of looking at the Bible, different ways of looking at authority, different ways of looking at ecclesiology, the church structures, and very much different ways of looking at theology in America that we'll get to in just a little bit. The second great quote that Hatch uses to illustrate this foundational shift comes from Philip Schaff, who taught over at Mercersburg, who wrote in 1844, tendencies which have found no political room to unfold themselves in other lands wrought here without restraint every theological vagabond and peddler who may here drive his bungling trade without passport or license and sell his false wares at pleasure. What is to come of such confusion is not now to be seen. The world of a confessional Reformed German is being challenged. The authority of a learned theologian is being challenged. The ways that the truth of the Bible was conveyed to people is being challenged here. And Schaff does not like it one little bit. He doesn't like the reorientation of the church. He doesn't like the fracturing of the church. He doesn't appreciate the ways that any old person, as he puts it, kind of without a passport or a license, without having gone to a seminary. These two men, Otis and Schaff, had studied theology. They were learned men. They were skilled in argumentation, and they were experts in their fields, and they were leaders in their field. And they were being challenged by just any old Joe who wanted to pick up the Bible, read the Bible, and make an interpretation. And that would be the most extreme vision or extreme version of these changes that happened in the late 18th and early 19th century that you could think of. Hatch makes the argument, he says, the wave of popular religious movements that broke upon the United States in the half century after independence did more to Christianize American society than anything before or since. So it's in this moment of transition from traditional ecclesiologies, traditional theologies, traditional confessions to a broadly evangelical landscape that really sets the tone for American religious history. And really, if you think about religion in America, it functions as a popular philosophy. How do you make sense of the world? How do you understand the world? And this is a very fractured and very populist type of religious expression that is beginning to grow in the first part of the 19th century, and then become the dominant theme by the 1840s and the 1850s in every realm of life. After the Second Great Awakening sweeps through the United States between the beginning of the 19th century through the 1830s. So it becomes the way of understanding the world, of making sense out of the world, which is, we talked about this a little bit a few sessions ago, talking about the ways that these arguments over the Bible and arguments about hermeneutics and the way you read the Bible and the way you read slavery into the Bible or out of the Bible are profoundly important in politics and war and in national identity. So you can't pull those threads apart. Religion is at the community level is woven into the United States. Whichever religious tradition takes root in a community becomes an important arbiter, an important social institution, very important centralizing factor. You can look at Georgia, and again, I talk a lot about Georgia, but that's where I study most closely. When you look at the post-revolutionary religious world in Georgia, the first thing you notice is Baptist, and the second thing you notice, it is very much, those Baptists are very much attached to the patriot cause during the war, and then in the reorganization of society after the war. There are a couple of great stories, apocryphal or not, but stories from Wilkes County, Georgia, in which Tories have the audacity to come in, or have the audacity to come into one of these Baptist churches, and in two very dramatic instances, they're dragged out of the church and kicked down the stairs or thrown down the hill. So there's a close relationship between the patriot cause and these rising evangelical churches and the communities around which they're built. And these communities that come into being as the nation is reorganizing after the chaos of the revolution are in many cases focused on churches, especially, we'll talk about this next time with revivalism, but especially in the areas that are being overtaken by Anglo-descended Americans, or now Americans, in the Trans-Appalachian West. Remember that one of the important things that Hatch points out is that there's a massive amount of growth, physical growth in the United States in the years immediately after the American Revolution, and people are moving into areas and seizing lands from native peoples that are incredibly sparsely settled, and it's these popular churches without the trained theologian that become centerpieces to these communities, the ways that these communities build themselves up. So it's all wrapped. This popular religion is very much wrapped up in the expansionism of the United States, the youth of the United States, the massive population growth that you see in the United States. So it's all wrapped up in making America. Religion is at the community level, not at the top-down level. It's not the rational religion of the founders. This is the popular religion of the people, and that becomes the foundation for making local communities and then creating and binding the nation together in very important ways. Which is why it's so important in 1844 and 1845 when the churches break apart. The big two, the Methodists and the Baptists, break apart. That's why people at the time thought, well, this is the first step to disunion. This is the first step of dividing the nation, because those churches have been so instrumental in keeping those ties that bound these disparate communities together into a nation state. So, what's the central theme here? I think that you can very easily see in some numbers, first off the growth, and then of these evangelical denominations, and then the importance of two in particular, the Baptists and the Methodists. And I've obviously talked about the Baptists and the Methodists a lot as we've had these conversations together. But here I think we'll get a little bit more of a sense of how predominant and how significant these churches were, these denominations were for making America. So the Methodists in 1820. First thing I want to say about the Methodists is the Methodists had a really hard time immediately after the Revolution. This is especially true in the South. Methodists had they were still the Church of England at the time, so it was very difficult for these men and families that had lived through the Revolution. It was very difficult for them to look at a church organization that was still bound to the Church of England, or still had links, and then later on still had culture, still had ecclesiological links to England, and the Methodists struggled a little bit early on. Again, particularly in the South. This is not true. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of variety up and down the Atlantic seaboard, but when you look at the South, especially, the Methodists really had a hard time because of their association with the Church of England and their association with Britain. In 1820, there were only 250,000 Methodists in the United States. In 1830, they've doubled to 500,000. And really, in that period between 1820 and 1830, you see a massive takeoff of Methodist affiliationalism. And one of the ways that this happens, especially in the South, is that the Methodists adapt themselves to the realities of the slave economy that's beginning to develop. And they make a lot of progress in the southern states and the slaveholding states in the 1820s and the 1830s because they've adapted to the realities of what that economy is looking like. The Baptists are more immediately connected in my mind, and I think in a lot of historians' minds, with the Patriot cause, with the politics of the Revolution, and their growth takes off about a generation and a half, maybe 2 generations quicker than the Methodists in a lot of places. There is a tenfold increase after the American Revolution in Baptist affiliationalism. The number of churches, including, I have to read this, the number of churches increased from 500 to 2,500 in that 30-year period. And the thing about the Baptist Church is that it is largely ecclesiologically, or the church organization is very local. It's the churches are run by local deacons. The deacons in the church together choose the ministers. There are no overarching hierarchies. There's a lot that's appealing to the revolutionary generation and the generation beyond that. And then even through like this afternoon, because of that independence, because of that local autonomy and the power to make decisions within a very small community. So that growth is kind of runs in tandem with the Patriot cause, and then the politics that come out of that. So the third area we need to look at and be thinking about, we talked about this some the last time we were together, the African American churches, and they develop in the same period. Independent black churches in the North, Richard Allen and the AME, in the Free States become incredibly popular, incredibly influential churches. Again, independent African American institutions. As we talked last time, there were large black churches in the southern states, in the towns and the cities in the southern states. You have large all-black congregations that have African American preachers, that have African American deacons, and those institutions grow up at the same time as these white institutions that are so vitally linked to the cause of independence and the cause of republicanism and the United States. So when you're looking at looking at these institutional developments, you need to be thinking about the ways that people are carving out their place in America, the way that they are creating an idea of how God works in America. And gosh, some Baptist in Georgia, Silas Mercer in particular, makes the argument in a very, very long essay in the 1790s that using the kingdoms that he's drawn out of the Bible, that the United States is the culmination of God's work in creating just and right political organizations for humans. That the American Revolution has brought to fruition this vision. So it's a lot of wrinkles to this, a lot of interesting variations, but by and large, this is very much a national. These are national, our institutions are creating nationalism and cultural nationalism, and African Americans are participating in this at the same time that white congregations are doing the same kind of thing. They're developing along parallel tracks, certainly segregated in most cases. But the real change in this doesn't really happen until the 1820s and 1830s, when some, Denmark's Rebellion and then Nat Turner's Rebellion are very much founded and rooted in religious ideology and religious faith. And there are a lot of whites in the South who begin to see, and whites in the North who begin to see this as a threat. So interesting parallels, but also interesting divergences that you see between the black and white churches as they develop in the pre-Civil War era. So what's the long and short of this? By the middle of the 19th century, the Baptists and the Methodists, both black and white, had begun to splinter. They had created multiple smaller denominations. The Baptists had developed into Free Will Baptists, which were more Arminian in their theology. The Baptists had developed also anti-mission, sort of back to the roots, back to the Bible, very back to the Bible. The Christian church that comes out of the First Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening in Kentucky, has a very restorationist theme within that church. So they take Presbyterianism and turn it into a more primitive form of Christian belief. They want to strip away all of the fanciness that's left in the church. And you can go back, you can go back to the Tudor and Stuart period in Britain and see these fights over the pure church. That's where the word Puritan comes from, is these are efforts within the Church of England to purify the church. So you can go back into the 16th century and see these conversations and see these fights over what the church really should be. And they're played out again in America in the first part of the 19th century. There's a lot of splintering. The AME splits in the AMEZ. The Methodist, you have Wesleyan Connection and other subsets. Later, after the Civil War, you have the Holiness Movement, which is already sort of a subset of Methodists, and before the war becomes a separate denomination after the war. So there's a constant splintering, a constant churn, a constant change that's going on as people are searching for their own way to understand the Bible. And when those clash with others, they just split and make up their own church, because there's not a centralized authority. There's not a Church of America. So that royal is very, very important in shaping the tone and the timbre of what's happening within these churches. By the mid-19th century, all of these new movements, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Christian, the Mormons, the Quakers, all of these denominations, all of these different variations form 2/3 of the Protestant churches in the United States. 2/3 are evangelical, Republican, common sense, very popularly oriented denominations. 2/3 of American Christians in the United States are practicing within churches that would fit within that definition in a lot of different ways, but broadly fit within that definition. So there's more to it than just the organization of the churches themselves. I've already mentioned this issue of population, but I want to come back because I've got some pretty interesting numbers here, and think about the demands of population growth and the demands of physical growth in the United States really work against churches like the Presbyterians, against churches like the Episcopal Church, the Lutherans. In some ways, the churches that are still confessional or more confessional or lean in that direction, and that depend on highly educated clergy and highly trained clergy. There's a problem because there are not enough of these guys. There are not enough of these trained ministers to go out into these new territories that are being taken over by white settlers in the expansion period, and they're looking for anybody that can preach, anybody that can help lend a hand. And this is also partly due to the fast growth of the United States. Between the end of the Revolution in 1845, the American population grown from 2.5 million, that's at the beginning of the Revolution, to 20 million in 1845. And most of that, the vast majority of that, is from a natural increase. It's just a very high birth rate. You have a very young population, and you have a rapidly expanding native-born population, and that is within Anglo-descended Americans and African Americans. The natural increase is dramatic between the end of the Revolution and 1845. So you got a high birth rate. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is the ratio of people to land. So that your population density barely doubles. Population, so you have a tenfold increase in the total population and a fairly insignificant population concentration. So that's a kind of a roundabout way of saying the United States is very rural. There's a lot of land at this point that's being taken from native peoples, that's being settled by white people, and in many cases enslaved African Americans during this period. So what is that kind of begs the question? I think it says, what does that mean for the churches? And it means that these they grow in this period during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They grow from being local institutions to being mass institutions. They're covering large swaths of territory where churches are being founded by the communities as they move west. You can follow these, north and south. You can follow these communities going west. You can follow denominations as they go across the Appalachian Mountains, as they go down into the Gulf South, to Mississippi and to Alabama, in the north you got Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin. You can follow the expansion. You can actually follow the denominations in a lot of ways as you see that growth. So it's a mass enterprise. What does that mean? Well, it means you need a lot of people to preach. You need a lot of people who are able to lead these congregations in these widely dispersed places. And there's Hatch, great with numbers. It's 1800. In 1775, as the American Revolution begins, there are 1,800 Christian ministers of all types. 1,800 Christian ministers in British North America in 1775. In 1845, there are 45,000 Christian ministers in the United States. Dramatic growth in population, dramatic expansion in the physical spaces occupied by Americans and where churches are being founded, and a massive growth in the Christian ministers. Theological seminaries they're not producing nearly enough graduates to lead these churches, and so the preachers end up coming from the ranks of the people. The idea of the farmer preacher in the Baptist tradition, somebody who farms during the week and then preaches on Sunday. He's not gone to theological institute, maybe has a little bit of education, but comes right from the people who he's preaching to, which means he has a lot of authority. It means that he uses vernacular language. It means that he has familiarity with the struggles of everyday ordinary people, unlike, at least in the minds of many Americans, unlike the learned theologians, the fancy pants theologians, the overeducated theologians who had traditionally led the churches in British North America during the colonial period. So you've got a tripling of the per capita ministers from the colonial era to 1845. There's one in the colonial era, you got one minister for every 1,500 people. In 1845, that's one minister for every 500 people. So you have a rapid expansion of the clergy, and most of that clergy comes from the ranks, comes from the common folk. And this is a very important part of how American religion is built in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And it changes the religious landscape. It changes it in its theological orientation, in its singing, in its everyday practices. And really, by the 1810s and 1820s, what would have been, in the Revolutionary era, insurgent groups, or they really hold the upper hand. They have become the dominant force in American religion. Then we can go back again, Hatch, with the numbers. Congregationalists had twice the number of pastors of any other church in British North America. They only had 1/10 of that number of preachers, or they only had 1/10 of the number of preachers that the Methodists did in 1845. They lose massive influence. They lose massive authority and leadership in directing the development of the American church, or the American churches. So this is a huge change. It's dramatic, and it's pretty rapid. It's the course of a couple of generations, a generation and a half, and you see in America the creation of a brand new religious landscape. These denominations, particularly the Baptists and the Methodists, and then later in the mid-century, the Mormons, are led by young men. And we'll talk about the Mormons some more next time when we talk about the burned over district and revivalism and religious innovation, because there's a tremendous amount of religious innovation that's going on. It's not just confined to the Baptists and the Methodists and their methods and their church organization, but it's also other groups, Christian Connections I mentioned before, the Christian Church in Kentucky, the Mormons in New York. Really important to think about, but that's a little bit digging down into the story a little bit deeper than we can go right now. But these guys, they set themselves up, consciously set themselves up as outsiders. They set themselves up as oppositional characters, oppositional to authority, opposition to tradition, oppositional to expertise. These become hallmarks of the churches and of the ministers leading them. Of course, that begs the question: well, what happens when you have an oppositional culture that becomes the dominant culture? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. When the Baptists are the insurgents, that means one thing, and when they become the dominant denomination in Georgia and South Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama, it means something very different. And the people who lead are different. And of course, there are people who break off from that. But we'll dig down into that. We'll dig down into the splintering a little bit more next time. So Hatch does a great job, and I think this is borne out in everything that I've seen in Georgia and South Carolina in this period. The men who lead these churches are hard-working people. They just don't stop. They have a vision, and they continue to push. They travel, they preach, they travel some more, they preach, they baptize, they preach some more, they write some sermons down on occasion and have them circulated. They're incredibly hardworking people. They have an incredible zeal for expansion. They want to see these institutions grow. They want to see these popular denominations expand. And you can see that with the numbers we've already talked about. You can see the fruits of that labor, the fruits of that unrelenting toil, the fruits of that vision to grow coming to fruition. And by the 1850s, the nation is solidly evangelical, solidly Baptist and Methodist, obviously with some wrinkles. But it wasn't, in 1800, I don't think anybody would have predicted that. Very few people would have predicted the success of the Baptists and the Methodists, except maybe some of the Baptist and Methodist leaders themselves. But these guys worked hard. They were hostile to orthodoxy. They were in belief and in style. They were untutored. They were unlearned. They were rough-hewn guys. The frontier preacher standing on a stump giving a sermon to 10 people. This is wherever they could gather a small crowd, they'd do it, especially in the early days. And of course, the Methodists had a circuit system where a minister would be assigned to a large number of churches or a large circuit, and he would have authority over those. Baptists are not exactly the same because they don't have the same sort of the same top-down church organization, but you do have a lot of Baptist ministers who are preaching at multiple churches. Very early on, the church services in some places, especially I was going to say especially in the rural South and the rural United States, most of the United States was rural, and the United States doesn't become an urban nation until 1920. So the demands for the ministers, even with this large expansion, is sometimes too great to hold services every Sunday. So there could be a Baptist farmer preacher who has 2, 3, 4 congregations that he preaches to, and he does it on a rotating basis. So they would have church maybe once every 3 weeks, or once every couple of weeks, or once a month. There's a lot of mobility, but it puts an especially heavy burden on these men. And one of the things about Methodist circuit riders is they physically wear out very early in life because of the arduous nature of traveling over these these dirt paths and through the woods and in the rain and just terrible conditions that they're encountering. So these early ministers are very dedicated. They're visionary. They are systematic. They do plan. They do organize. They organize associations in the case of Baptists, which are groups of churches that come together for consultation once a year. And the Methodists had classes. They had circuits, it's the formal structures of the church. While they were still popular, the formal structures of the church grew. Sunday school unions, Sunday school associations, singing organizations began to appear within these churches. So there's a lot of really kind of nitty gritty detail work that's going on to bind these churches together. So the thing that this provided, though, the thing that this leadership, this popular leadership, this leadership from the roots up provided was for everyday folks was a real compelling vision of individual self-respect and collective self-confidence. They could do this themselves. They could become a minister. They didn't have to be born right. They didn't have to be wealthy to go to seminary. They could do it themselves. So the practice of the churches bred more confidence in individuals and individualism, and promoted this notion that America's real strength was from the grassroots up rather than from the top down. And this becomes a very important trait in American cultural identity. This idealism that focuses on individuals and self-sufficiency, and this hostility to authority, this hostility to expertise, is borne out very, very dramatically and very powerfully in the way that these churches were organized early on. Again, they're untutored, they're irregular. But they became overwhelmingly successful. These are outsiders. Again, the problem with this outsider notion is that eventually they become the insider because they are the people who are the leaders. But again, that's for next time. And they spoke to people. Farmer preacher is not going to speak like somebody trained at Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, or Andover, or Yale, or Harvard. Or Union Seminary. There are seminaries that are built in the United States, But by and large, the people who are delivering the sermons are speaking the vernacular language. They're using everyday idiom to express their religious ideas. And this is a familiar it's a familiar way of speaking. It's extemporaneous. They're not oftentimes not. You're not looking at prepared sermons. The Spirit moves through the minister, and the minister preaches or speaks extemporaneously. And again, this is very different than what you know, if you're an Episcopalian or a Catholic, or you go to a Lutheran church, you're going to see a liturgical performance that has uses a prayer book. That's not what happens in these popular denominations. So they do the same thing in print, and in magazines. They do the same thing in music. The music is simplified. You know, later on, you know, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, you're going to be hearing shape note singing, a really profoundly powerful way of singing, but it's very simple. And the words of those shape note those shape note songs are, you know, about the everyday experience of, number one, conversion, and number two, living the Christian life, and this idea of holiness, this idea of making yourself as close to perfect as you can, of self-discipline, of being rigorous in the ways that you approach your life, and being very conscious in the way that you perform your duty. And again, that kind of links into republicanism. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. But you know, this is a theme that Hatch points out is very important. As he sums it all up, he says the Americans in the early part of the 19th century came to exalt religious leaders short on social graces, family connections, and literary education. Their movements offered a humble and marvelous sense of individual potential and collective aspiration. The rise of evangelical Christianity in the early republic is, in some measure, a story of the success of the common people in shaping the culture after their own priorities, rather than the priorities outlined by gentlemen such as the framers of the Constitution. They move far beyond the Constitution's structures and language, the types of authority that are suggested there, and they build their own culture within these churches, and men and women alike. We'll talk more about women's activities next time, especially when we think about the camp meeting revivals. Really important aspect of the camp meeting revival. So we'll examine that next time. Just as a point of contrast, this is important to think about, because I claimed earlier that this is a brand new way of looking at religion and experiencing religion in England. So this is these are the Americans are descendants and have these close connections with England. And in England during the same period, and it's from the end of the Revolution through the beginning of the Civil War, had a very different religious experience. They had a very different, the religion took a very different trajectory. And it's because the church is still established. There's toleration, but there's not this kind of free market. And again, that's part of it too. We maybe do that in some questions and next time, because I do want to talk about free market, the markets and the relationships between markets and the kinds of religions that were popular. But in England, you see a very different trajectory. You see a very conservative retrenchment, and the conservatives really exert themselves again because there is a state church and a very well-established, well-defined, long-standing ecclesiological body that runs the church. They can express this, they can enforce this kind of conservatism, and they are in England. They're number one. They're responding to radical attacks on the church, which is not something that you're seeing in the United States. In the United States, in fact, you're seeing almost exactly the opposite: a radical embrace of the church. But in England, you see these attacks against the church. You see you see the development of the industrial state. There's a need for discipline. There's a need for authority, and in some places in the United States, you see that. You can see that. You can see it very clearly in some places in the burned-over district of New York. And again, we'll talk about that with revivalism, because that's really fascinating stuff, what goes on in the burned-over district. But in any case, in England, it's much more pronounced, because you have that state church, that long-standing ecclesiological body that runs the church and functions as oversight. And then you've got class conflict that's coming out of labor strife, that is pushing the church to enforce or to encourage or to emphasize deference and paternalism in traditional social organization. So while the United States is seeing a fracturing and expression, and seeing expressions of popular authority, of popular belief, the overthrowing of deference, and at least in the forms of the ecclesiological bodies and the church bodies, the overthrowing of paternalism, you end up with a very, very, very different religious landscape. So that's something of a quick 10,000-foot view of Hatch's notions and Hatch's ideas about the democratic nature of the social nature of the churches and the political nature of the churches, and the nation building nature of the churches. I want to talk just for a few minutes about the theology that comes out of this, and we've kind of hinted around at this in thinking about pro-slavery theology and thinking about African American religion, but I want to come back to the specifically particular theology, and it's kind of an overarching theological construct that you see, and it runs the gamut from Unitarianism to Reformed to modified Calvinists. You see in the early part of the 19th century, late part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century, it's sort of a constellation of ideas that kind of come together that theologically define the conversations that are going on within these churches. So now we know a little bit about how the churches developed, how they functioned, what they were doing, or how they were contributing to American nationalism. So a little bit about the structure, but I want to talk about a little bit about the ideas and about the theology and about what you might have been able to or what you would have heard had you been in a Sunday school or in a preaching service or at a camp meeting. What were some of the major themes that you would have seen and heard and been familiar with had you gone to any of those places? Because it's very clear that there's a set of ideas that do bind us all together. The best expression of this, well, there are two great books from the early part of the 21st century. They both come out in 2005 and 2000. One comes out in 2005, one in 2006. Brooks Hollofield's American Theology. Man, if you would really want to go down into the details of every theological tradition and do a real close intellectual history of American Christianity in the first half of the 19th century, Hollofield's book, Theology in America, is worth the time. It's not the easiest book to read, but it is a profoundly important description of how Americans believed. And the differences in the belief systems that Americans developed. Mark Knoll's book, America's God, is a social history of theology, and I think this is a much more approachable book, and I think in a lot of ways it's a lot more interesting than Holofield. Not to say that Holofield's not worth reading, and it certainly is. If I was going to read them, I'd read them, and I would read Hatch first, and then I'd read Knoll's America's God, and then I'd really take that deep, close look through Brooks Hollofield's Theology in America. So, but what I want to talk about now is Mark Knoll's book, America's God, and tangentially talk about his book, The Civil Wars of the Theological Crisis, because that's he takes the ideas this thematic that he sees in American theology and applies it to the crisis of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Really important, short little book, but very dense little book. And it's called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. I think it's 2006, University of North Carolina. But all these books will be you'll find links to all those books that I've mentioned in well, except for all of them. In the comment section once we get this thing posted up. So anyway, let's do a little bit with America's God, and then we'll think about where we want to go next time. So Noel, fantastic scholar of religion, one of the great thinkers of American religion in the last 25, 30, well, gosh, now 40 years, I guess. And in this book, America's God, which is a social history of theology, he makes a very kind of a simple claim that the theological debates between 1730 and 1865 were as contentious as any previous era in the Christian West. It's a pretty big claim to make, but if you think about the ways that the church, as we've already talked about, the ways that the church changes, it's inevitable to come to the realization after a little bit of study that the theologies and the competing theologies, especially as you see these denominations fracture, they fracture over the ideas, over the ways of reading the Bible, understanding truths about the Bible. So it's just as important to think about the fracturing of ideas, the changes in the ideas, in the ways that Americans approached a very specifically American, or created a very specifically American theology. The arguments that you see, they're nothing new under the sun. They're not reinventing the wheel here, but they're coming at the questions in very different ways. And the questions, to what extent was human nature incapacitated by sin? How did the fall of Adam and Eve affect later generations? What about imputation? How was Adam and Eve's sin imputed to humanity, and to what degree was it imputed? Important questions. How did God's grace work to rescue sinners? How does God save people? And that save becomes a very, very important word in American evangelicalism. But how does God's grace work to rescue sinners? It's an unmerited gift. How does that unmerited gift come from God and go to people? That's a very important question, because it has everything to do with conversion, which is the theme in American evangelicalism. What's the best way to describe the atonement? What does Christ's sacrifice mean? What does the death on the cross and the resurrection mean? And people have very different views of exactly what that means and how that works. This is one of the more interesting areas, is could there be some form of Christian perfection before eternity? Could you create a perfect society? Well, the holiness movement in the Methodist Church says, yeah, you can. And Methodism in general says, you can get close. And that leads to a lot of really important reform movements in the United States. It leads to temperance movement, it leads to women's rights movement, it leads to anti-slavery. It is this idea of perfecting America, this perfectionism, this millennial vision that humanity can approach close to perfection, and then Christ will return and will reign for 1,000 years. That people can prepare the way for the return of Christ on earth. So this idea of, can we be perfected? What is the nature of reaching for perfection? Breeds a lot of the political conflicts that you see in the middle part of the 19th century. So they work back and forth between each other, these ideas, and then the institutions and organizations that are created as a result of it. But the important thing that Noel points out is that while these questions are being debated, they're being debated amongst the elite, and they're being debated amongst everyday folks. And they're also being very much molded by the times, by the revolution, by this idea that people can make their own way. So all of these questions become wrapped up in that idea, that revolutionary idea of people being able to make their own way. And this has profound importance for the ways that these theological debates take place. It's also really important to note that it's happening amongst the elite and happening amongst the people. I mean, theological debate is it's kind of entertainment in a lot of ways. There were Arminians and Calvinists, Silas Mercer and Sanders Walker in Georgia. They would tour the state, arguing about the ways, about whether God was the God of Calvinism or the God of Arminianism, whether you had to depend wholly on God for conversion or whether you could ask for conversion. It's a very important question, and these men would tour Georgia and South Carolina, having that debate over and over and over again. So in a lot of ways, it's popular entertainment, but it's also very important. They're making very important observations about theology and about belief and about the place of Christian thinking within communities. So this social history of ideas, how ideas in society, in the society in which they live, is really at the heart of what Noah was doing, which is what makes it fascinating, because it's a very fluid kind of a book. And a very fluid way of looking at theology. It's not a fixed object. It's always changing, and it's always being adapted to the conditions that surround it. That these ideas don't live outside of the society in which they exist, but they live as a breathing, living part of these societies in which they're built. And it really helps us to understand why Christianity, why and how Christianity develops differently in the United States than it does in Europe, in England, and in Europe more broadly. Context matters. Context matters. So when we're thinking about the European heritage, theology was primarily Calvinistic. It was confessional. It was scholastic. It was kind of top down. It was controlled by an elite clergy that are trained either in Britain or in the new colleges and seminaries that develop in the United States, Yale, Harvard, then later Princeton. It's the old style. We've already talked about. There's not a lot of them. They're very well educated. They're adept theologians. They're intellectual. They're scholastic. They're the old style. But in America, as we've already said, as I've already pointed out, that changes. You got massive expansion, you got physical expansion, you got population expansion, and you have the demands of people who want churches, who want religious instruction, and who are receiving it from their neighbors, receiving it from the farmer preachers. So this is a big shift in the way that the theologies work, in the ways that the ideas emerge and develop, and that are preached and then practiced and then adopted or adapted and then changed. It's all about this tension, this change, this fracturing that you see in the first half of the 19th century. So Noel calls this an American, this network, that kind of this overarching network of ideas that binds all of the theologies that develop in the United States, by and large, is the American synthesis. They're taking ideas, they're breaking them down, they're putting them together in new ways, simply put. And there are three elements to that. The first is this evangelical Protestantism. The idea is to get people to convert and to become Christians. How that happens, again, is a part of the theological discussion. How does Calvinism work in this case? If God has preordained, well, that's a question. So even in the schools where Calvinism still held great influence, there were questions about the degree of Calvinism, the degree of predetermination, and the other elements of the Calvinist system. Republican ideology is the second part of the synthesis, and the third part is common sense moral reasoning. So let's unpack those for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on. We'll be finished for the day. So what are the elements of that synthesis, of the American synthesis? Gosh, I'm having a hard time talking all of a sudden. First thing, and I've already said this once, I'll say it again because you can't say it enough times about evangelicalism in the United States. It's all about conversion. And this largely comes from this emphasis is very much fueled by the First Great Awakening in the mid part of the 18th century, and then again by another round of revivals in the first part of the 19th century. But conversion is the key. Bring the good news to people, preach it plainly, encourage conversion, and then everything flows from the conversion, the practice of holiness and the support of the institutions, and all of this flows from that. Bible is primary authority. Creeds, tertiary at best. No creed but the Bible is a popular saying. We don't have any other document that defines our faith except for the Bible. And they're throwing out those old, learned statements of faith. And they're claiming the truth of the Bible is the Bible itself and only the Bible. So the Bible itself is the supreme authority on all questions, not a creed, not a confession, the Bible. Third, personal holiness. Again, practicing rectitude, practicing a restrained life, which then develops into temperance, which develops into anti-slavery, and all sorts of other forms of personal self-discipline. Some historians would say that personal self-discipline has a lot to do with the ways that the American industrial economy is developing in certain parts of the United States. And you can see that again. Once again, we'll talk about this next time when we talk about the burned over district. The link between holiness, self-discipline, and learning how to work in a factory, or learning how to work on a time clock. Learning how to be a merchant, learning how to be a good and honest shopkeeper. There's a very close correlation in some parts of the United States between the two. Even though, and I said that again, I've kind of hinted at this, even though all of the traditions that you see in the United States, or almost all of them, are descendants of Reformed churches or Reformed theologies, they are all deeply shaped by and deeply changed by revivalism, and that emphasis on immediate conversion in a lot of cases. And that becomes a very, very important component. How does Calvinism work with immediate conversion? Well, Arminianism fits better with that, because Arminius says you can approach God and ask for forgiveness. Well, these become very important points of theological disputation in the 19th century and through the entire 19th century. This less so after the Civil War. Still present. The important thing, and this is something we always have to keep in mind, is that republicanism is a part of this theological construct about this overarching synthesis. And that is, and again, this kind of goes back to this notion of how churches help people adapt to a changing market economy. And so republicanism is the emphasis on private character, is the foundation of public well-being. It's also the foundation of politics in the United States. So there's a link, the idea of personal rectitude, of self-discipline, of meaning what you say, of being honest, of being forthright. That character is the foundation of the public weal, not just the individual. And that carries this faith, and that carries this way of seeing the world, seeing the world religiously, into much broader context in the United States in the mid-19th century. Again, it sounds like a broken record, but there's a mistrust of intellectual authority. And then there's a belief in common sense. And the most important form of common sense, and it could be Scottish common sense philosophy, or it could be in a formal way, or it could be just a common sense, plain style reading of the Bible. The hermeneutic that becomes dominant in the United States is this literalist, and we talked about this with the pro-slavery theology, that you read the Bible literally for the words, and that's it. There's nothing beyond the plain, simple meaning of the text in a literal sense. And that obviously makes some problems in the mid-19th century, but it is a commonality that all of the denominations share. I had a great quote, I thought, from Timothy Dwight about common sense, and I think that I've lost it. So I think we'll have to end without my great quote that I found. Yeah, I have mislaid that. In any case, this idea that anybody can simply read and understand and apprehend and then teach. That is Dwight's notion of common sense. He's preaching at Yale, so this is not something this is in the late 17 or in the early 1790s. Not something that is simply attached to these farmer preachers. Because this notion, this common sense notion of how to apprehend the world, how to understand science, how to understand nature, how to understand biblical text, can all be done by anybody using the common, simplest understanding of the literal text in front, or the literal observations that you make. And that is the hermeneutical foundation, or the way of reading the Bible, foundation of this theological system. So I think that's where we want to wrap things up. It would have been more eloquent had I used the words of Timothy Dwight, but I didn't. I had to kind of fudge it a little bit, but that's all right. You get the point. So what I want to do next time is talk about itinerants. These guys, these ministers who move around from place to place. Dive a little bit deeper into them. Talk about Lorenzo Dow and American Methodism. And talk about the revival movements and the revivalists themselves and the denominations that come out of that, the strange combinations that you see in places. I want to talk about the Second Great Awakening more largely or more broadly, and that might be kind of the overarching theme of next time, is the Second Awakening. Talk about Charles Grandison Finney and the New Means revivals. These guys, as I've pointed out before, these young men who are out and about promoting these religious movements are very much promoters. And Charles Grandison Finney takes that to the extreme and becomes an incredibly important revival leader in the 1850s. So, and then we'll ask the question that Paul Johnson asked way back in the 1970s. Was all of this revival business just a vision of a shopkeeper's millennium, which is an interesting combination of Republican rectitude, evangelical faith and self-discipline, and emerging market capitalism in the United States. So that's where we want to go next time. Rob will have this posted up shortly. He'll also have the titles of the books that I've mentioned posted up. Send questions, hit questions on the comments section in this, and we'll be happy to get back with you. But thanks for sticking around. Sorry about the technical problems, but the technology ain't perfect yet. So anyway, y'all take care, and I will see you before too awfully long. Thanks.